This program is supported in part by a grant from the Alabama Humanities Foundation, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Yes, sir. I grew up sailing this bay. My granddaddy was harbor master in Mobile, and his daddy was a bar pilot. Although during the war between the states, he found blockade running to be a more lucrative trade. There's a lot of stories out there. You know that the Corps of Engineers has counted 282 shipwrecks around this bay. Every one of them tells a story. And there's university professors and shrimpers and sailors and fishermen and old salts like me. All of us got stories, and some of them are even true. Stories about Mobile Bay and the way it was.
This is what's called Ecor Rouge. It's the red cliffs or bluff along the east side of Mobile Bay. That we're standing here looking out over the bay on what I've heard is the highest bluff on saltwater between Mexico and Maine. I think I've run into a lot of people that have heard that, so I guess it must be true. This bluff is made up of a sequence of sediments that have been brought here by a large river that flowed in this direction, that we could think of it as the ancestral Mobile River. After the delta form that built up these sediments across Mobile and Baldwin County, the area that is now Mobile Bay started to slowly sink. There was a fault on either side, a fault along the east side, a fault along the west side, over where the hills like Spring Hill, Cottage Hill, and all of that line of hills in western Mobile are. That's the other side of this big fault block. When you have a block that subsides with a fault on either side, it's usually referred to as a graben, and this is called either the Mobile Graben or the Mobile Bay Graben. Well, as this area was sinking, of course, it encouraged all the water in this area to run through that low place. Water is naturally going to seek its lowest way to the sea, and the Mobile River got established in its path across this area. But then a few million years ago, the climate changed and we entered what's been called the ice ages, the Pleistocene glacial stages. And the glaciers formed and melted several times. Well, when the glaciers formed, the ice piled up at least 2 miles thick on much of the North American continent. As the water was taken out of the oceans to build up the glaciers, sea level dropped considerably. And as sea level dropped, then this river running through this large valley had further and further to go to get to the ocean. The coastline was probably 50 to 100 miles south of where it is today. For instance, when they were building the Interstate 65 bridges across the Mobile Delta, they had to go down to some depth to find something solid enough to hold up the bridge. And as they did, of course, they went through all sorts of old forest, trees that had been buried as much as 60 or 70 feet down underneath the delta, which gives pretty good evidence of what this was like before the present-day delta was formed, that this was probably a little more tropical. Here, the bluffs along the eastern side of Mobile Bay represent the old fault line scarp. Well, as the waves in Mobile Bay cut away at the foot of the bluff and at the layers of sediment all around the bay, they gradually wash it away, and as they do, they unearth fossils. Here in my hand, I have a couple of such fossils. These are horse teeth that were loosened from the sediments in the bay shore, and these are fossil horse teeth, not from modern horses. This is from a Miocene horse, a horse that lived some 10 to 15 million years ago. And in addition to this horse fossils, we found other fossils in sediments of the same age around the Mobile area. Up north of Mobile, along Chickasaw Creek, we found fossils of rhinoceroses. We found fossils of antelopes. We found fossils of alligators and fossils even of a river dolphin that lived in the area. Then as the ice melted and sea level rose, the water moved back up in the bay and filled up that old river valley, making what is an estuary. Mobile Bay is an excellent example of an estuary, simply a drowned river mouth. If you look back to the east of us across Mobile Bay, it's about 7 miles wide here. The background over there you can see Red Bluff or Ecor Rouge. It's a huge drowned or inundated river valley around 9000 BC. You would see between here and there a number of valleys. Those river valleys are now inundated or flooded with sand and silt, and the old banks of those rivers are now 40 to 60 feet below the surface. But the camps of the earliest Indians who lived in this area are undoubtedly along the banks of those streams. Around Mobile Bay, Mississippi Sound, and along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and throughout the Mobile Tensile Delta just to the north of us are literally hundreds of shell mounds. To the south of us, along the Gulf and Mississippi Sound, are numerous oyster shell middens, and they revisited these shell middens, or places where they collected mussels and oysters and clams over and over for thousands of years. To the south of us on Dauphin Island is a huge shell mound. It's on the northern side of Dauphin Island, on Dauphin Island Bay, and it's been occupied off and on for a period of about 3,000 years. We're on Dauphin Island, which is an ancient sand dune that's located on the north central Gulf Coast. If you had been an Indian when the first Indians came here about 9000 BC, you wouldn't have found the beach where it is today. If you'd wanted to go to the beach and collect some oysters or spear some fish, you'd had to have gone about 20 miles to the south of where we are today. Sea level is constantly rising, and over the last 11,000 years or so, the sea level has risen on this coast well over 100 feet. Indians certainly had gotten here by 9,000 BC. We don't find their artifacts on Dauphin Island. As a matter of, when we find their artifacts, they usually come up in a shrimper's net. I'll get a call every once in a while from a shrimper in Balabatry that he's found an arrowhead. In archaeology, we call them projectile points. He'll say he pulled it up in his shrimp net maybe 20 miles south of Balabatry or 20 miles south of Gulf Shores. The projectile points that they pull up in their shrimp nets are basically of this type right here. This is called a Clovis projectile point, after Clovis, New Mexico, where they were first dated. The date right at 9,000 BC, or about 11,000 years ago. This is the Bryant's landing site. We're on an old oxbow lake, what at one time was the Alabama River, and this is one of the more interesting of the 2,000 archaeological sites in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. The lower levels of this site date back to about 2000 BC, and the most recent, or the upper layers of the site, date to somewhere between AD 1250 and 1500. The important thing about this site is that it's a stratified site. That is, it's layered. We have layers of shell. These are Rangia clam shells, and they're interspersed with layers of silt. These layers of silt represent the time when the lake or river flooded, and of course the people who left these shells would have moved out during those periods of time. This site has provided us with a tremendous amount of insight into the past, the Aboriginal inhabitants who lived on the north central Gulf Coast. The clams are the most obvious food source here, but mixed in with these clam shells are lots of other things as well. They're pieces of pottery, or we call them potsherds, scattered along the beach, diagnostic of the various cultures that inhabited this old levee. But also present, mixed in with the clam shells, are the bones of various types of animals, and there are also bone tools and stone tools in this site, and pieces of charcoal that can be used for dating the different layers. This is one of the most, the richest archaeological areas in all of North America. The sites they vary from numerous very early prehistoric sites that are 4,000 years old, up through the largest Indian ceremonial center on the north central Gulf Coast, which is the Bottle Creek site. The site is right in the middle of one of the largest swamps in the eastern United States. Now, this site is right in the middle of an 8,000-acre island, which is in the middle of a 180,000-acre swamp. In order to get here, people had to use dugout canoes. We have to use boats to get in here today. So its isolation has helped to protect it from destruction. The Bottle Creek site is of international importance. It's one of the most significant sites in all of North America. The site covers more than 100 acres. It has 19 earthen mounds. It's the largest site on the northern Gulf Coast. One of the main journals for archaeologists is American Antiquity, and this was listed as the #1 site in all of the eastern United States that needs to be preserved and protected in American Antiquity. This is Mound B. It's a large earthen mound that's 43 feet high. And the Bottle Creek site was occupied by what we call the Pensacola Mississippian people, first occupied about AD 1250, and they lived here until probably around 1700. By the time the French came in, when Bienville was governor of French Louisiana in the early 1700s, he came out and visited this site, and the Indians by that time had gone. He brought with him some Choctaw Indians, and they didn't know anything at all about the site, and they said it was a place that had been inhabited by the old people. This site was the primary ceremonial center for the north central Gulf Coast. At its peak, it was probably occupied by about 2,000 people and served as the home at least part of the year. During the drier months of the year, it served as the home for the chief, or the cacique, as the Spanish called him. And this individual would be like a god king, and he was over a province of Indians. And the province that this was probably capital of was called Achuse. Achuse may well have extended eastward to Choctawhatchee Bay and northwest Florida, and up the Alabama, up the Tombigbee River, and westward into Mississippi. This site may well have served as a center for salt trade. Some of the artifacts that we found on the surface of this site are pieces of large salt pans, which were very shallow plates that were just a few inches in depth and up to maybe 2.5, 3 feet in diameter. Agricultural peoples have to have salt. If you don't have salt, you'll die. They may have traded it as far out as the plains area. In the early historic period here in southwestern Alabama was something called the Mobilian trade language. And in the 1700s, it contained words of French, Spanish, and also Muskogean, the language spoken by these people undoubtedly who lived on this site right here. And if you left Mobile and you went out into the plains and you wanted to communicate with the Plains Indians, you could do so using the Mobilian trade language. We think that that language may have had its origins in the salt trade, which may well have been centered on this site right here. The Indians who lived in the southeastern United States were some of the most complicated and sophisticated peoples who ever inhabited the prehistoric and protohistoric southeastern United States. Their symbolism and iconography was very complex, and they were involved in both extensive and extensive trade. They traded all the way as far to the southwest as Mexico, the southeast as far as southern Florida, and traded well up into the Appalachian Mountains. The big mound center, like the one at Bottle Creek, not only served as a place where they exchanged goods and services, but also ideas as well were exchanged in a place like that. These people were primarily geared to a maritime economy. They traveled around in dugout canoes like this one right here. This is a small dugout canoe. This one is only about 10 feet long, but some of the larger ones reported were up to 70 or 80 feet long and were ocean-going or Gulf vessels that were capable of going across the Gulf of Mexico, and undoubtedly they traded very, very widely around the periphery of the Gulf.
Commerce wasn't completely new to these people. When the Europeans came poking around the Gulf Coast, it had been going on for centuries. Now, if you talk to an archaeologist, an anthropologist, 2 historians, and an old fisherman, you'll get 5 different opinions about who was the first European to sail into Mobile Bay and when they did it.
Well, of course, the first person, according to legend, to sail into Mobile Bay was Prince Madoc of Wales. This is an old, well-known legend among residents of the Gulf Coast. And it's a nice story, but I think that probably we will have to keep it at legend, because in reviewing the contemporary documents, one finds that the only reference to Prince Madoc of Wales is that there was a person named Maddox, and he was a prince in the era around 1100. But the only known fact about him is that he sailed. We don't know whether he sailed east or west, and certainly we don't know if he sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and certainly not to Mobile Bay. But the point is that he could have, and that is enough for any legend.
The story is based upon a number of rather arcane and fugitive bits of information. Some say that Dog River proves that they were here. It was Mad Dog River. Well, that's very good, except that Dog River is a translation of Rivière aux Chênes, which was a French name. Well, O'Shane doesn't have much to do with Madoc, so that seems to be the end of that. The Pope had drawn an arbitrary line through the New World, giving one side to Portugal and the other side to Spain. And the Gulf Coast had fallen within Spain's area, so whatever the Portuguese did here was illegal and had to be kept quiet. So for that reason, we do not know really what Portuguese were here or when they were here, but they must have been here before the first Spanish explorers came, because there are maps based upon their explorations. So probably the Portuguese were actually the first here.
The first depiction of Mobile Bay is credited to a college professor at the College of St. Di in what's now Alsace-Lorraine, or Alsace-Lorraine. And presumably he was working with the records of Amerigo Vespucci, and Waldenseemüller is the person who named America, America. He's the one who picked up Amerigo Vespucci's name and turned it into North and South America. And there is a large bay on his 1507 map called Espiritu Sanctu. No way to tell whether Waldenseemüller's Bahia de Espiritu Santo was Mobile Bay or Galveston Bay or Escambia Bay at Pensacola, or any of the other major intrusions that the Gulf makes onto the continent. Just no way to be sure about that. But for certain afterwards, all the Spaniards were looking for Espiritu Santo.
There are reports of a Spaniard called Pineda. And Pineda came around in 1519 along the Gulf Coast. Whether or not he came into Mobile Bay is not known. It was probably, in my opinion, the Mississippi.
It's pretty likely that in 1540, De Soto passed through the Mobile Delta on foot, plundering his way through the countryside in search of gold. He had arranged to rendezvous with his fleet under Admiral Francisco Maldonado at a place called Achucy on the northern Gulf. And we're pretty sure Achucy was either Mobile Bay or Pensacola Bay. Anyway, the search for gold was not going so well. And De Soto didn't want his men to know that they were close to the fleet, because he was afraid they might try to mutiny and go home. So the fleet waited at the place called Achucy.
And that brings, I guess, probably the first beautiful, quaint, appealing legend of the Gulf Coast, and that's the beautiful Lady Isabella, who is supposed to have pined on board one of the ships waiting there for De Soto, who never came. And a really far-fetched tradition that she planted the fig trees, which from time immemorial have been on Dauphin Island. How the Lady Isabella happened to have fig trees along with her, I don't know, but it's a nice story anyhow. And then came the period of the pirates, Where there's gold, there are always pirates. And when Mexico and other parts of Central and South America began to produce gold, and the great plate fleets, as they were called, the treasure fleets, went to Spain, they circled, they brushed along the Gulf Coast and went around Florida and then across the Atlantic. And so Mobile Bay then became a rendezvous for the pirates who preyed upon the treasure fleets. And that annoyed the king, so he decided that he would establish a colony on Mobile Bay to make sure the pirates didn't use the bay. And that brought Tristan da Luna.
But probably the first really description of Mobile Bay that could be said to have been a true description and that indicated that the person so describing it was actually here was made in 1558 by Guido Las Bazares, a Spaniard who was making a survey for the expedition of Tristan da Luna.
Bazares even described the high red bluffs on the eastern shore that became known as Ecor Rouge.
The Alabama Bay is unquestionably Bazares' Bahia Filipina, whereas earlier Spanish expeditions could have been in any one of several intrusions by the Gulf into the continental land.
So the decision by the King of Spain to establish a colony on the eastern shore to keep pirates out of the bay was the reason that Guido de Las Bazares provided such an accurate description of Mobile Bay in 1558. It was a reconnaissance mission for Tristan da Luna, who followed from Veracruz with a fleet of 13 galleons and caravels, loaded with supplies and 1,500 colonists. Tristan got into some bad weather in the Gulf, and that was just the beginning of his trouble. He arrived at the peak of the hurricane season and probably anchored either in the lower bay or over near Pensacola and came across to the eastern shore of Mobile Bay.
Then he traveled up by Fish River and then up to the lower Alabama River. The way that we know that is by the distribution of Spanish coins. There have been a number of 2 real Spanish coins that have been found all the way from Choctawhatchee Bay across to the Bear Point Indian Mound, and then at a large shell mound near Gascue, about halfway between Gulf Shores and Fort Morgan. Then another one of these 2 real coins was discovered down near the mouth of Weeks Bay, and then yet another on the lower Alabama River. These coins have an L or a Luis Rodriguez assayer's mark on them. And Luis Rodriguez was the assayer in Mexico City after the attempted exploration of the southeast by Hernando de Soto. So we know that these coins date after de Soto and they're not from his expedition. Also at from a large Indian burial mound up on Pine Log Creek in the northeastern part of the Mobile Delta, there are a number of Indian pottery vessels as well as Spanish artifacts that have come from that site. This is an axe head made out of a single piece of stone. They're sometimes called a spud. It's a ceremonial axe that is probably the sign of the highest office, sign of rank of the highest office among the Mississippian Indians who lived here in the southeast. This Mississippian culture was still going when Tristan da Luna entered the lower part of the Alabama River Valley. So there are Indian artifacts in these mounds as well as Spanish artifacts. The Spanish artifacts included a holy water set consisting of a little bronze pail and a candlestick, a chevron, several chevron beads, as well as an ear spool. But Luna's expedition was ill-fated and he had to pull back. Starvation and all sorts of disease accompanied his attempted settlement.
Well, the bottom of the bay is covered with wrecks, or what's left of wrecks. The first one, well, of course, Tristan de Luna's fleet was wrecked in Mobile Bay in 1559. A story that was told me many years ago in that connection is of interest. This man said he saw this happen. It was when McDuffie Island was being made. It was being made by dredging the bay. And he said he got a call to come down and see something interesting. So he went. And there they had, up by a crane or by a dredge or something, the stern of a Spanish galleon, which they had dredged up out of the bay. And everybody said, "Isn't that interesting?" And they said, "Yes." So they dropped it and covered it up. So there's probably the only proof we might have had of this 1559 hurricane. And poor De Luna lost his mind. He became insane from all of his troubles and so forth. And so the colony faded away. So if they had persisted here at Mobile, Mobile would be older than St. Augustine. But they didn't, and so that was the last of the Spaniards for a while. It remained then for the French to take up where the Spaniards had left off.
Robert Cavalier de La Salle came down the Mississippi, you know, in 1682 and claimed the Mississippi Valley for France. But nothing much was made of it after La Salle's 1687 attempt ended in disaster. From then on, there was not much activity here until the Spanish made some claims in the whole Gulf area, which excited Louis XIV's attention. And he began a mission to this area in order to fortify the claims of La Salle's 20 years earlier. And for this expedition, he chose Lemoyne d'Iberville. And Bienville, his brother, was also on that expedition, and they came here, first of all, to Dauphin Island in 1699.
They anchored the large ships out in the Gulf to the south of Fort Morgan, to the south of Mobile Point, and they got into some shallow draft lighters, smaller rowboats, and they went around Mobile Bay. It was a rainy, foggy day. They went up into Mobile Bay, then came down the west side of Mobile Bay, and then went around Dauphin Island. We know a lot about this because of Pennico's journal. Pennico was a Canadian who came with Iberville and kept the records for Iberville, kept a log for Iberville, and he describes Dauphin Island in detail on that first visit in the late 1600s. They went all the way around Dauphin Island, and on the western end of Dauphin Island, they found, in Pennico's words, a mountain of bones. And Pennico speculated that that mountain of bones was a result of an Indian battle that had recently taken place on the island. And that mountain of bones gave the first name to Dauphin Island. Pennico and Iberville called it Massacre Island.
Back in the era of around 1700, there was a large spit of sand that jutted out on the south end of the island, and it made a very good harbor. It was quite deep offshore within that protected area. And so large ships could come directly from France, and that became the major port for the whole Gulf area. And they apparently weren't quite sure where they wanted to settle down, so they tried a location over at Biloxi Bay, and after about 2 years, they decided that was very inconvenient. They had to portage everything across from small islands out in the Gulf to Biloxi. And so they eventually gave up there and moved over to Mobile Bay, where they had a little better harbor out on Dauphin Island. And after establishing a warehouse there and a port, then they came upriver and looked for a likely location for a town site. And it was at 27 Mile Bluff that they finally decided to build a town. This spot in the woods is, we think, the location of the original French fort, which was right in the center of town. And we have several old maps. This is the 1702 map of the fort showing the general outline of it. This fort was called Fort Louis de la Louisiane. It was named after Louis XIV, who was still king in France. He had an extremely long reign, and this was right at the very end of his lifetime that this fort and colony was established. And so the entire colony was also named after him, Louisiana. This was really the capital of French Louisiana. And the French actually did control a large part of the central United States. Back before the United States existed, they controlled thousands and thousands of square miles of the central Mississippi Valley all the way up to Canada and over to the Rocky Mountains, and actually to the east almost to the Appalachian Mountains. This is about 50 miles from the Gulf. It's quite a long distance, and it turned out that there wasn't any good channel from Dauphin Island to the site of Old Mobile up here at 27 Mile Bluff. So they ended up having to transfer everything off at the Dauphin Island port and move everything up by small boats to the town of Old Mobile.
Well, the big ships, the ocean-going vessels, such as the first one to come here in the 1702 expedition, I remember, was the Renommée, meaning the renowned. And it was about 600-ton vessel. You could not go up the Mobile River very far in one of the big 600-ton ships. What you had to do after you landed that kind of ship at Dauphin Island was to shift the people and the goods into smaller boats. And then you would go up to, you reach the Dog River Bar. When you reached the Dog River Bar, you had to shift in, sometimes even into still smaller ships to get over the bar and then up the river. For that reason, they built a warehouse there in 1702. Smaller ships, such as the famous one that came a couple of years later, was the Egg. It was about 300 tons burden. The Pelican, which is maybe the most famous ship of all, was about 560 tons burden, as I remember. And, you know, every once in a while you see a painting of the Pelican girls getting off at the bluff up there at 27 Mile Bluff, and Bienville and Tonty extending their hand welcome. But that could not happen because the Pelican could never have gotten up to the, it docked, moored at Pelican Island and never got any further than that. Well, these ladies were chosen from the convents of Paris, and they were chosen largely on the basis of their morality. They were good girls, and the reason the French made it a point to choose good girls is because they did not want any floozies down here stirring up the men who were stirred up enough as it was. The coureurs de bois, or the Canadians that came down the river, were runners of the woods, and they were a pretty wild bunch. But it was the strategy of Bienville and Iberville to settle these Canadians down, make them do a little farming instead of hunting, and building instead of trapping. And thereby they would build up the colony. So once having found these nice girls in Paris, then they were put on a ship, 23 of them altogether, and to come over here. Unfortunately, when they stopped in Havana, they were having a yellow fever epidemic, and some of the girls were and men were bitten by the mosquitoes, and they carried the virus. It took about, I guess about 10 or 12 days to sail from Havana to Mobile. And by the time they got here, they were just beginning to notice the symptoms. And they slept out a few nights, and the mosquitoes began biting the infected people and then transferring that virus to the to the rest of the settlers. And the disease then spread to the Indians.
And one unexpected consequence of this was the fact that there were all sorts of diseases that were introduced unintentionally by the Europeans into the Indian populations. And these were diseases like measles and smallpox and even the common cold that the Indians had never experienced before. They had no immunities, and so they died in large numbers. The populations were devastated really by this contact with Europeans. Well, the location at 27 Mile Bluff is rather high. There are only a few really high bluffs along the lower part of the Mobile River. And this is one of these few spots that never floods. As far as anyone has known, this location has never been underwater. So it seemed like a good place to set up a colony. It turns out that the area is quite small. It is immune to flooding, and if you move back a few hundred yards, you run into swamps and other areas that tend to get very boggy after heavy rains in the spring. So the French eventually learned that this area is not exactly ideal for a town, and they decided after about 10 years of living in this area to leave.
So the whole colony moved down the river to the present site of the city of Mobile. And in 1717, they built a fine brick fort. They called it Fort Conde in honor of the great French general. Meanwhile, to encourage settlers and investors, the French changed the name of Massacre Island to Dauphin Island for the Dauphine, the crown princess of France. There were 20 fortified houses on Dauphin Island. Pelican Harbor was the port of entry for the capital of the French territory at Mobile. French ships from the ports of La Rochelle, Rochefort, Bordeaux, St. Malo, Marseille, Nantes, Bayonne, Havre, and Dunkirk anchored in the shelter of Pelican Bay.
In the early part of the 1700s, after the French had developed their little fort on Dauphin Island, they had a buffalo on the island, and I'm not sure where the buffalo came from. I can't find any accounts of its origin. But anyway, this buffalo was allowed to roam around Dauphin Island, and it was treated as a curiosity or a novelty. And when the Jamaican pirates attacked Dauphin Island around 1710 or 1711, one of the things that they tried to do was steal that buffalo. And I'm not sure whether they got it or not, but I believe the way that the little story ended up was that they were not able to capture the buffalo when it continued to roam around the island.
For many years, the French in Mobile and the Spanish in Pensacola existed on the Gulf Coast side by side. They were both, as far as they were concerned, at the end of the world. They thought that you just couldn't get any farther away from beloved France or beloved Spain than the Gulf Coast. Nobody sent them food for ages. Nobody sent them any kind of supplies. And so one of the most interesting pages in Mobile's history is the long love-hate relationship that existed between Pensacola and Mobile. Neither one of them would give up claim for the mother country of the entire Gulf Coast. And they were both hungry. So whenever either one of them got anything to eat, the first thing that was done was word was sent to the other one, we got something to eat, come over here and we'll give you some of it. So they shared their supplies. The home governments were in an outrage over it. I mean, the idea of feeding your enemy was something that just wasn't done.
Those French colonists endured yellow fever, flood, pirates' attack, and hunger. And still the French hung on to that little colony. But then one of the most powerful forces of nature intervened, and the future of Mobile was substantially altered.
The coast of Alabama is affected by a hurricane on the average of once every 52 months, and this has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. When the French Canadians first came down, they built out here on this outer beach. Cadillac was the Canadian governor. Cadillac came down here for an inspection, and he read those folks the Riot Act. He said, you have built on the outer beach, and when a hurricane hits this place, it's going to knock all your houses down. You don't have a lick of sense you'd better move back inland, move back behind those dunes back there so that you'll be protected. In 1717, a hurricane hit, and it closed up the harbor, which was down here, the main harbor, and it drastically modified Dauphin Island, and that led really to the movement from Dauphin Island over to, they tore the buildings down, what was left out in Dauphin Island, loaded them on ships and took them over to New Orleans.
Now, harbor in Pelican Bay was only adequate for use by an occasional ship passing to or from the new capital of New Orleans. And the former capital of the Louisiana Territory was reduced to a military garrison and an Indian trading post. Back in France, Bienville got the blame for most of the problems that were plaguing the colony, and he was recalled to France for investigation in 1724. His ship, the Bellona, set out from the capital at New Orleans.
The ship was carrying goods from New Orleans to France, and it stopped at Mobile Bay before it had planned to head on to France.
Bienville's ship was loaded and they were ready to go back to France, and he had the ship anchored in the roadstead, which was just off the southern shore of Dauphin Island, down here about a half a mile.
Bienville was on the ship when it began to sink, but he got into a lifeboat and escaped. After it sank, and they tried to salvage it, but nothing was ever gained, and I would imagine that the goods are still down there as well as the ship. It's never been recovered. I would imagine that if you could drain Mobile Bay and the surrounding area dry, you would be amazed at what is still out there.
The British came into possession of Mobile almost by what you could call default. At the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, whichever is your choice, they both say the same thing, the Peace Treaty of Paris of 1763 caused France to cede all of its continental North American colonial possessions to Great Britain, and Mobile was among them. One result of the British occupation of Mobile was a simple name change, and Fort Conde became Fort Charlotte. Just 17 years later, on the 17th of March, 1780, through a pact between the American colonies that were in rebellion and Bernardo de Galvez, who was the colonial governor for Spain at New Orleans, Galvez attacked Mobile and captured it on the 14th of March, 1780.
Galvez left New Orleans with a fleet of 12 vessels. He tried to enter Mobile Bay during a storm, and 5 of the vessels ran aground, including the frigate Volante. The crew managed to remove guns and provisions and attacked Fort Charlotte that protected Mobile. After 14 days of siege, the Spanish flag was raised over the city.
The Spanish colony at Mobile that began with the 1780 takeover really sort of withered on the vine, because you had this Spanish territory which was along the edge of the Gulf, but the infrastructure, the interior, belonged to the United States. So there was nothing for the port to feed on. There was no direct cooperation. And Lucille Griffin has summed it up as well as anybody has, and she said, quote, "The history of the last Spanish period is essentially the history of the whole colonial period. In it, there were 3 factors at work: rivalry between European nations, Indians, and the land. And in the end, the land won." The Spanish held Mobile from 1780 until 1813, when in the middle of the War of 1812, Brigadier General James Wilkinson, American, who was based at New Orleans, led an invasion. I won't say attack because I don't believe any shots were fired, but he surrounded the fort and demanded that the Spanish surrender, and the Spanish had lunch and then agreed to surrender. So in 1813, specifically on the 12th of April, Mobile became American.
The Spanish relinquished the rundown old fort without a fight. And a few days later, Wilkinson sailed down to the mouth of Mobile Bay to establish Fort Bower on Mobile Point. You see, the War of 1812 was still going on between the Americans and the British. In September 1814, 2 British frigates and 2 brigs attacked Fort Bower. The Hermes led the squadron, and our captain must have been pretty confident about his encounter with the small American fort, because he dropped anchor before he commenced firing. As the garrison and the fleet were cannonading each other, a shot cut the anchor cable of the Hermes, and she drifted under the guns of the fort and ran aground on the same sandbar that got Galvez's ships 32 years before. About 11 o'clock that night, she blew up, sank right there. By this time, you'd think it's getting a mite crowded down there on the bottom of this old bay.
The seas and the rivers were the lifeblood of Mobile from the very beginning. Of course, the only way to get to Mobile was by the sea. Now, unfortunately, for most of its history, from the French period up until the dawn of the American period in 1813, Mobile was cut off from its great river basin because boundaries were run across. And so that hindered its growth as a port, but in 1813, finally the river basin and the port were united, and Mobile's growth as a port has dated from that time.
Alabama, with Mobile included this time, as opposed to when it was separated by being Spanish when the rest of Alabama was American, gained control of its own destiny when it became a U.S. territory in March 1817. After a short waiting period, just 2 years, it became a state in December 1819. I think perhaps the best way to sum up the importance of Mobile in the antebellum period is to begin at the end by saying that as the Civil War approached, as we're in about 1860, the annual exports, in other words, the export economy of the United States, totaled $300 million. And of that $300 million, $200 million was represented by cotton. Now, that includes gold from California, that includes the products of the industrial Northeast, that includes the rice crop from South Carolina and Georgia. And despite all those factors, 2/3 of the total export economy of the United States is based upon cotton. How did this come about? How did Mobile become so important? The answer lay beginning right with General Wilkinson's capture. As soon as you united Lower Alabama with Upper Alabama, and the river infrastructure became a significant contributor to the trade of the port boomed literally in no time. It would have happened in any case. The speed with which it occurred can certainly be attributed partly to steamboats. In no time at all, both New Orleans and Mobile have supplanted Charleston as the kingpin port of the South. As steamers gathered in importance, I mean, literally by 1827, you could call Mobile a steamboat-cluttered port.
And the steamboats got bigger and bigger, more palatial and more palatial, and the great gilded era of the floating palaces had come. And that's one of the most interesting aspects of Alabama's history, I think. We think of Alabama as a great plantation state We think of the great Greek temples, the Greek temple houses looking over thousands of acres of cotton land, and the plantation life a la Gone with the Wind. And we have the impression that it was very old, but it wasn't. It was only about 30 years old when it all came to an abrupt end, because it was in the 1830s that these great plantations were laid out in the Indian lands, and it was at the end of 1865 that it all came to a rapid halt. So it was a spectacular, flamboyant, quick period in Alabama's history, this period, this plantation period. But of course it is one of the most glamorous and one of the most appealing.
And that's the way it was on Mobile Bay. Come back again next time when I tell you about Mobile Bay's golden age, the cotton boom, and how that boom went bust when one of history's most significant naval battles was fought right here on Mobile Bay. Join us for The Way It Was on Mobile Bay, Part 2, Cotton Bales and Gunboats.
If you have comments or want information about how to obtain copies of any of the programs in this series, write to Public Television Services Mobile, 700 Donald Street, Mobile, Alabama 36617, or call 1-800-239-5233.
Nationwide, an average of 24 children die each year.
And another 17,000 are injured in bus-related accidents.
Many of these can be prevented. The safety of our children comes first.
For the safety of our future, obey all traffic laws related to school bus safety.
Hi, I'm Pat Mitchell, Director of Transportation for the Mobile County Public School System. We're asking you to obey all bus safety laws. It could save a life. Remember, stop ahead when you see red. Our future depends on it.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
in together now. We can make it better now. Come on.
Moving a little and eating better every day can help make you and your child healthier. Search We Can to find out more.